Salutations and welcome back to the Anti-Federalist Project. I am Jacob Solt, and I'm embarking on a project to disseminate my research on the Anti-Federalists. In this video, I would like to take the opportunity to reflect on my research and discuss what I've learned from it, in terms of the general principles on the theory of history, and how the theory of natural rights or natural law has important potential implications for the interpretation of history. The issues that I will be discussing in this video are not contained explicitly in my research, but I believe that some of the things that I gleaned from embarking on the research revealed several themes that could have significant importance for anyone who is attempting to dig into the primary sources with an eye to creating a synthesis for interpretation and thereby contributing to the field of history. And I break this up into 4 principles or reflections. The first reflection that I would like to make is that ideas are important. Like many fields, historians are likely to be unfamiliar with the philosophic underpinnings of their own study. And before you think this is to impugn historians or to provide any slight, let me be clear that I think this lack of sensitivity is perfectly reasonable and is common to nearly any field. Just as it is not common for an automobile mechanic to be familiar or sensitive to the principles of automobile engineering. And the automotive engineer may not have all the skills and techniques necessary to rebuild an engine given her possible specialization, or how a doctor, though familiar with pharmacology, would be unable to synthesize the pharmaceuticals she might prescribe to her patients, even if she had all the necessary components and laboratory equipment. And yet the chemist/pharmacist may not have all the qualifications necessary to prescribe medications that they are creating. Likewise, historians may not always be sensitive to the basic philosophic assumptions that might guide their conduct in the work of doing history. After all, we all feel we're fair-minded and reasonable individuals, right? But the problem as I see it in going forward, without having our particular philosophic assumptions examined, is that we all have a background of assumed principles and frameworks for making interpretations, and we are not always sensitive of the power these philosophic assumptions can have for our interpretation of the world. Just as I argue that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists both struggled with their own internal contradictions, it is possible for any of us to have the same internal contradictions that we are only vaguely aware of, unless we submit our every belief and assumption to the most rigorous of critical and philosophic examination. And this process is not for the meek and the mild. This process will make the most ideologically bold to take pause, to literally question everything, taking nothing for granted. And I'll be honest, it can drive you a little crazy. But I think this is so critically important. Ideas are powerful. If you for a moment doubt this, then I would submit to you to consider this passage from Ludwig von Mises. In a battle between force and an idea, the latter always prevails. Repression by brute force is always a confession of the inability to make use of the better weapons of the intellect. Better because they alone give promise of final success. The ultimate outcome of the struggle, however, will not be decided by arms, but by ideas. It is ideas that group men into fighting factions, that press the weapons into their hands, and that determine against whom and for whom the weapons shall be used. It is they alone, and not arms, that, in the last analysis, turn the scales. And when viewed this way, I think it is clear the importance of ideas. Truly, all human action, being acts of the will, are acts which are based on judgments of value, which chooses the suitability or unsuitability of means, and then directing those means at definite ends. That is to say, human action is necessary volitional, or perhaps put more simply, our actions are based on choices we make to accomplish the outcomes that we would like to see in the world, and our ideas shape the means we choose to employ to accomplish those ends. Therefore, every action being a choice, by the individual to pursue that individual's chosen end state or preferred outcome, all based on their ideas as to the means that will most likely accomplish that outcome. You know, as Mises would say, it is ideas that ultimately press the weapons into the hands of fighting men, and it is ideas that direct that man with how he shall choose his action. And we literally live and die with ideas. And could there then be anything more important than the critical analysis of our ideas? Well, let me continue to exposit on what ideas I think are important for the theory of history. I am a second-rate philosopher on my best days, so please feel free to critique these ideas, but I offer these as tentative principles that I think are significant. The second principle: people must be analyzed historically as individuals. In my research of the Anti-Federalists, the primary sources, as I've said in previous videos, were very diverse, and it was difficult for me to create a unitary interpretive framework that would cast all the Anti-Federalists together. And some Anti-Federalists were worried about the use of standing armies, some were worried about the vague language of the Constitution, some just wanted a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, and some saw in the Constitutional Convention an attempt of the elites to form a new aristocratic government. And the list goes on. The point is that any attempt to force this divergent evidence and squash it together in a definitive fashion just to make a generalization that fits nicely into our conceptual architecture would be to gloss over the richness of the primary sources themselves. The reflection that is relevant to historical interpretation is that all of the groups or classes or interests that we attempt to employ to make historical generalizations are always going to be an inaccurate deviation from the manifold divergence of the evidence. The evidence is nearly always going to be more diverse and multifarious than we might expect. And this is the same common principle involved when we caution against the use of stereotypes. If you can find one outlier that clearly belongs to the group in question but deviates ever so much from the generalization, then the generalization is necessarily inaccurate as a comprehensive statement. And I think we can do better. I feel that as responsible historians, we need to be circumspect in our generalizations regarding any use of generalizations to define or create groups or classes or interests, and rather imitate the statisticians, being aware of our own degrees of confidence. History is rarely concrete and definitive by its very nature. It's interpretive. With history we gather evidence, but the evidence is never complete, and there are no perfect records of history, and perhaps without perfect omniscience there can never be a definitive history, for such would have to have on record the very thoughts themselves of all the individuals. Remember the importance of ideas. And there's probably a lot more that can be said on this account, but I'll move on to the third reflection or principle I had on completing my research, and that is that individuals must not be assumed to be internally consistent. And this, of course, directly involves my frustration in trying to make sense of all the Anti-Federalist objections to the Constitution. Ideas gone unexamined allow us to adopt mutually exclusive ideas, or ideas that contradict one another. But the problem is that sometimes the contradictory ideas are never consciously or directly combined, so we proceed sometimes for a long time with these mutually exclusive or unexamined assumptions, and then something comes around to challenge one or the other of the ideas, and we must proceed to make some reconciliation, some exception to the one idea or the other, permitting us to proceed with life, and sometimes without letting go of either of the deeply held, mutually exclusive ideas. And I'm not speaking here of how I think we should proceed to reconcile ideas, but how sometimes people do process ideas. Therefore, we should not assume that anyone, even the most rigorous philosopher, is necessarily internally consistent unless such can be shown to be so by the capable refutation of all challenges thereto. And maybe I could make this another reflection, but I'll fold it in here. Be sensitive to the fact that people can change their thinking. Madison is a great example of this. For in the beginning, during the ratification debates, Hamilton and Madison would emerge as the strongest advocates for the Federalist position. Yet over time, Madison would break off from Hamilton and align himself with the Jeffersonian position, which would really be the standard bearer for the Anti-Federalist tradition. All right, and now for the fourth and final principle, and perhaps the most important principle of historical analysis, is the issue of force in the forms of violence and the threat of violence. I think historians need to be especially cognizant of the use of force in history. The use of force denotes the breakdown of a voluntary relationship between persons and that generally people can get along very well without resorting to force. I think of my own personal life, and consider your own. How many of the people of whom you are acquainted use force against you? Hopefully none at all. And if such person were to use force, either the explicit use of violence or the threat of violence, hopefully you or I could remove ourselves from the social association of that person. And I don't see how that same principle cannot be extended to all spheres of human interaction. What I'm suggesting is the possibility for a sublimation of the normal political analysis in history to the more fundamental ethical analysis. Well, I would like to share with you a quote from Acton, actually, that I find personally inspiring, speaking here to an audience of university students in 1906. "But the weight of opinion is against me, when I exhort you never to debase the moral currency, or to lower the standard of rectitude, but to try others by the final maxim that governs your own lives, and to suffer no man and no cause to escape the undying penalty which history has the power to inflict on wrong." If we are to take Acton's course, and the one I'm suggesting, we would use the same ethical analysis that we would apply to our own personal and social lives, and extend that to the political and economic spheres. In this way, the complexities that develop in our political analysis can be dissolved into a basic ethical analysis. If you happen to subscribe to an alternate ethical theory, whether utilitarianism or ethical relativism, I will not here attempt to dissuade you, but if you, like myself, accord to individuals human rights that can never be legitimately violated by the initiation of force or aggression, then I would entreat you, in your analysis of history, in the themes and interpretation, never to let those who initiate aggression to include violence and the threat of violence against others to get away with it. I would entreat you to allow history to forever condemn such heinous acts. Allow the ethical principle of the Nuremberg trials to carry through to all historical analysis. Allow no excuse or legitimization of aggression against innocent parties. Some might describe this as a call for a revisionist history. But if our interpretation of history proceeds from flawed assumptions based on the legitimization of force, should not this history be revised? And I would suggest that historians should proceed from first principles. They should not be respecters of persons, but lay out the evidence and name the villains as they present themselves. Ralph Raico, in his lecture, Classical Liberal Historians, paraphrased those words of Acton's as, "Don't easily exonerate any of the powerful persons in history. Push and push into the evidence and find the whole story." Well, time being what it is, always fleeting, I will leave you with one last quotation, this time from Thomas Burke in 1777, speaking in the finest of Anti-Federalist tradition. "The more experience I acquire, the stronger is my conviction that unlimited power cannot be safely entrusted to any man or set of men on earth. No men have undertaken to exercise authority with intention more generous and disinterested than the Congress. How could individuals blessed with peaceable domestic affluence endeavor at increasing the power with which they are invested, when their tenure of it must be exceedingly dangerous and precarious? This is a question, I believe, cannot be answered but by a plain declaration that power of all kinds has an irresistible propensity to increased desire for itself. It gives the passion of ambition a velocity which increases in its progress, and this is a passion which grows in proportion as it is gratified."